Well, hello everybody. My name's Raoul Boughton. I'm the wildlife biologist here at the Range Cattle Research and Education Centre. For those of you who are joining by webinar, you can actually type your questions into your GoToWeb meeting panel, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So today I'm going to be talking to you about wild hogs and big data, and mainly the big data part. How do we deal with millions of game camera images to answer questions? In this case, specifically hog biology and management. This came up from our studies in terms of us being unable to actually handle the volume of data that was coming through some of our work here at the in Florida and actually in California and other sites in the US. I'm going to start off with actually acknowledging all of the people who work towards this. And of specific acknowledgement, you need to look to Michael DeBack and Mohammed Nurazada and Jeff Clune and Ryan Miller. These four people conceptually came up with this idea and had the expertise to actually do this. And if we didn't have those people on board and this collaboration was together, this would never have happened. And I'm the small player in a big project. So wild hogs, why are we interested in this? So 5 years ago, we started a collaborative study with the USDA, and it started in 2014 and we got on the ground in 2015. So we're really interested in understanding density, demography, reproduction and survival. And to do that, we actually have to monitor the species. And one way to do that in wildlife studies is through game camera imagery or capture recite spatial models. And that's where our big issues started. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. Other parts of this project included spatial ecology, movement, where we're actually putting equipment on animals and talking about equipment that could communicate between livestock and wildlife. And we also were interested in how we could control populations, and through our game cameras and spatial ecology equipment, interested in how these control programs actually change interactions or space use by hogs, what the effort is needed to lower those populations considerably, and what time it is for the population to recover. All of those things require us to be monitoring these pigs and collecting data. On top of that, we also do disease sampling because we're actually interested in the diseases they carry and how they relate to livestock. We're particularly interested in antimicrobial bacteria, which is the ARMS-resistant microbes. And finally, we're particularly interested in damage assessments. So that includes attacking crops, doing rooting damage, and the cost of that to an actual community. All of this requires us to actually monitor pigs. And one way we're doing that is with imagery. The project's bigger than just Florida. It's actually two big sites. One was set up on the Tejon Ranch Conservancy in California, and one was set up here at Buck Island Ranch in Highlands County. So the Highlands County site is about 3.5 miles wide and 6 miles in length. It's in Highlands County, of course, and that's just north of Okeechobee if you don't know Florida very well. So on this site, we organized to deploy cameras to actually capture the occurrence of pigs. For instance, for occupancy modeling, did they occur there? How often were they there? Did it change over time? But then also density. And for density sort of estimates, we actually have to know individual ID. So we actually marked pigs as well. So cameras are placed in piggy areas where pigs move, and they'll be on fence posts, on trees. And in the long run, we ended up having a camera per square kilometer across the ranch. Now this involves 44 game cameras. They were deployed in August 2015 and have been continuously running since. So every single one of those cameras is continuously actually capturing pictures. We originally had them set so they would capture pictures constantly. So basically take a picture whenever it was triggered every second. That doesn't work very well on a ranch. We figured that out pretty quick because within the first month, we had 1 million pictures on like one camera. And so you're dealing with 1 million pictures is really hard. And they're all cows, well, nearly all cows. So you learn as you go ahead. And so we made some adjustments to the way those cameras were being actually programmed, and they ended up having quiet periods of every 5 minutes. And we end up just taking a burst of imagery if it's actually triggered. They're maintained monthly, and currently we process about 100,000 images a month are collected from just the Florida site. There's about 20,000 from the Tajon site, so there's less activity there. And that the change in activity is all cattle. But in lots of ways, we're not interested in the cattle all the time, so we want to get rid of them. So the project involves catching pigs and marking pigs, and we do that through a variety of methods. Mainly we catch them in cage traps or corral traps. They're usually baited with some sort of bait, typically sour corn. We also build trailers to actually manage hogs so that we don't have to anesthetize them all the time. So in this case, it allows us easy handling. And you can see in some of these pictures marked pigs. And so here's one that's getting an ear tag, number 97, and lots of people helping us. And in the bottom is the trailer being worked, and in the top picture is an anesthetized pig getting a collar put on it for our GPS work as well. And so we've done that quite a lot on pigs, and you'll see all of these pigs. These pigs are not dead, they're asleep. Somebody's asked me that, are they all dead? No, they're actually anesthetized, makes them immobile, and so we can work on them pretty easily and get all of these samples from them. The important part from this particular picture is every one of these pigs is unique, well, almost. There's 2 329s if you look at that carefully. And so they're unique in terms of number and in terms of color combination as well. And so when they're actually coming through or past a game camera, we can identify every black pig that we've marked anyway to a unique ID. That's important for classification. So does it work? So here's some game camera imagery. For those of you who are in the audience, and you can shout back at me, you know, what's in the top left-hand corner? Those who can see, can you read that? 136, yeah. So, and the bottom left. Bottom left, 42, 42. So the numbers are pretty easy. The one in top middle has no marks, and the ones on the right-hand side are harder to actually read. So they're a little blurry. And so we need to actually get to the point where people can actually see these. So part of our problem when we started when we actually started getting all this imagery was, how do we get to the pigs? And so to do that, you actually have to go through every image, usually with a person. By the way, the one on the right is 130, and the one on the bottom is 98 or 88, can't remember. Anyway, so summarizing our information of this major study over 5 years, this is what we've sort of done. Well, really, it's 3 years in the field. So 772 feral hog captures, and we've put out 300 unique marks, so 300 pigs with marks out there. We removed some of these pigs during our capture events, and there's been 260 non-marked hogs removed, so we didn't capture all the population all the time, and 121 marked hogs removed during removals, meaning that we didn't capture all the pigs that we marked either. So if that makes sense to people. But the big part of this talk is that we've taken, over that time period, greater than 4 million images. And now that's creeped up to about 7 million images for the whole project, California and Florida. At the same time, we've also, in Florida, deployed about 111 GPS units, and we have about 500,000 locations of where pigs are, and we do all sorts of things with that data as well. This is not a pig. This is a beaver. I was going to say beaver. No, okay, good. So it's an otter. And there's actually 3 otters in this picture, one standing up and then two walking along. So we get lots and lots of other wildlife. And so the imagery is not just for pigs, that's our main focus, but we're interested in how all the other wildlife interacts on a ranch or interacts with pigs as well. So we started off not completely naive. We knew there was going to be a lot of work in understanding how to put this image together and how to identify this image. And there's been a pretty big project run by Colorado Parks and Wildlife over many years, and it's called the Cpw Photo Warehouse. And this is an access database that actually holds images, and you can use it to actually view image, summarize image, analyze images. The big thing for us is it's double blind entry, meaning that two people identify those images, and it's got a third-party verification process. So every image we had, we would get two eyes on it. They would identify it. If it was correct from both of them, it would say, okay, that's good. You both got the same species. We're fine with that. If they identified it differently, a third-party verification was needed to actually ID it. The big thing to us too was the actual access database that allowed what we call module creation, where you could actually package 10, 20,000 images together in a module and send it to somebody, and they could actually ID all of that work for you. And that's the way we did this double blind process, is 20, 30, 40, 50 people over the US were actually helping identify these images at any one time, most of them volunteers, or slave undergraduates, is that what we call them? Yeah, so undergraduates who are really interested in the project. And they helped here and at Colorado State University as well. It's tried and tested. It's been used on many, many research projects. And of course, when we get involved, we break it. And so that's part of the problem. The breakages come a little bit later, but one of the big things about the database is that you get all your stuff in there. You got all of your species ID. You may actually have individual ID in there. You can automatically create the data tables and data output needed for statistical or analyses. And so you can use that for occupancy modeling, for mark recapture, and those sorts of things. So automated data manipulation is really helpful, and you can just rerun it. And it's rather than taking days and days and days to create tables together, it's taking us a few seconds over hundreds of thousands of images. And so and I will say this, it is an excellent data management tool, and we are using it to actually do that still. So what problems did we have? So there was too many photos for MS Access. We actually couldn't deal with it. So we overburdened the actual software on a computer in about 1 to 3 months of our original data collection. So that's solvable. So really what ends up happening is that we moved the actual software to an SQL server platform. So a server can handle a lot more data. And we solved that issue. That server created a little bit of another issue because it's housed on a USDA site, which requires us to actually have security to log in, but it's a very fast and great place to have data. So just think through your head, how much space does 7 million images actually take up? Just go through that, 7 million images at probably 5 to 20 megabytes an image. That's a lot of data. And so that's why when using just a simple Access software program, it can't deal with the volume. So you need the server to do it. So we're unable to keep up with images. And what ends up happening is we have 100,000 images. We need 200,000 IDs, double blind, plus a verification. This ends up being 80 hours a week, full time, at least, to actually keep up with this. We really didn't have the funds to do that, and we didn't expect to be getting this many images out of this project. So 1.5 million images have been identified and verified over the first 3.5 years. And we're like, great, but we've still got to get to, in Florida, 4 million, in the whole project, 7 million images. So we're way behind the 8 ball. We've either got to recruit a huge number of undergraduates, and most of them don't last more than a few months when you're doing this sort of thing. And you can only put about 10 hours work of this type of work on a person. a month, or they get bored too. But anyway, so it's really difficult to actually do this. So how do we move forward? And the way we're going to move forward in the long run is actually using artificial intelligence. But this is the actual Colorado Photo Warehouse interface, and I pulled a few of these off for you. So we can actually view photos, and so in this case, we're looking at the Buck Island Ranch, one of the sites, and we're looking at this species. If you can see the species ID, it says, somebody says it was a gray fox. Okay, it's not a gray fox. And if you look down in the right-hand corner, there's also a species that says coyote and gray fox together. You can see that species list down the bottom. Meaning somebody identified it as a coyote and somebody identified it as a gray fox. Obviously, we need to get better wildlife biologists out there because it's not a gray fox. But the point is that it needed to be verified, and this is a problem. So people actually input mistakes here too, and probably more than computers would if you could get a computer to do it for you. That's the important point here. And I would say on average, we had about 20% of our images that did not have consensus. So 20% of images needed to be verified by a third person, if not more. That's the problem with using inexperienced undergraduate people in projects like this. So this is spotted skunk, just to give you an idea of some of the species. Panthers coming through. So you can tell all these species quite easily. Wild pig, hopefully you can see that. But there's another problem here. If you look down the species area here, this came up when there was said to be a mountain lion. It's obviously not a mountain lion. So the other problem we have is actual keystroke entries. So people have actually probably identified it correctly, but done something silly in terms of a human error. And they've done a keystroke entry wrong, and it's just error. Or they're trying to really upset us and put in everything as a mountain lion, one or the other. I don't know if you can see this very well, but there's about 13 bobwhite quail in the grass there. And there's a little head sticking up looking at the camera right at the front. So we're getting all sorts of imagery all the time. So if we actually expand that sort of interface, this is sort of the interface you see, and we can actually use, we wanted to maintain and continue to use this photo warehouse on the SQL server to be able to do all of our data manipulation still. But we couldn't get identification into it quick enough, and in some cases, or well enough. The last thing I wanted to mention before we move on is that in this photo warehouse and talking about data manipulation, here's an example. Here's a very, very quick way of actually looking at activity over, in this case, about 56 weeks, starting from the beginning of the study, right? So about a year's worth of data. What is the activity in bobcat daily for the Buck Island Ranch? Okay. And in this case, we actually chose bobcat and coyote. And this took me about 3 seconds to run for this database, and there it is. Right? So all of these things, when they're actually pushed together into a system, makes it very quick for us to actually visualize the data and start to analyze it. So this is daily movement patterns of bobcat and coyotes. And what you can tell is they don't move in the day and they move at night a lot, which is pretty typical of that species. So trying to get that ID in was a big challenge, and we had a lot of talking about it. And like I said before, there was 4 individuals who really pushed it. And really, this is artificial intelligence classification. So we were stalled by the ID process. That's not me. And we needed 6.9 million images, and it's constantly growing, identified. We had 1.5 million, and what could we do with it? So here's a question mark of a poor undergraduate student or graduate student or postdoc or professor going, how can I actually deal with this much data? We've collected it, we really want to get at it. And the way to do it is actually out there and has been used a lot by some big companies. So you think about Google or Facebook, or walking through the airport in US Customs is a good one. So facial recognition uses this sort of software application as well. And basically what it's saying is once it actually develops a way, you become a unique person. And it's even more developed than this in terms of facial recognition. But can you actually use the same type of software in terms of neural networks or machine learning to identify species in an image? And this has been done before, and they've been slowly getting better and better and better. And there was a paper in 2018, just this year, that came out of Africa, until our project, one of the largest image databases out there. And they asked the same thing, all right? And one of the authors on this paper, who I mentioned at the very beginning, he was involved in that project as a software engineer and was able to accurately identify many species to 98% confidence. That's pretty amazing, or 95% confidence. Anyway, so we're going to use that same process, and it's a machine learning process. You don't have to understand this part of it, okay? But what we're doing is we're asking the machine to learn how to do a complex task. And we're going to provide it training to do it. You needed to see 3 images of a coyote to understand it was a coyote, correct? At some stage in your life, you had to be told that was what it was. So you learn. You didn't intrinsically suddenly just know it was a coyote. That's the same for all other species. It's the same concept. So we're actually telling the computer, this image is a coyote, identify. Use some process in there to identify it. And we trained the model to identify species. Once that model is trained, so we're using our 1.5 million images to train it, it should be able to apply that process to a unique picture, as long as it's seen it before, and say, okay, I know what that is. Does that make sense to everybody in the audience? This is where it doesn't make so much sense. So how does it actually do it? So this is using an image classification, and they call it a pseudoneuron. And so in this case, there is actually 3 inputs from the image. So every pixel in that image, okay, has 3 bandwidths of color, red, blue, and green. We're only using red, blue, and green to train this classification process for every pixel, what that species is, nothing else, right? And so it goes through a process of actually saying, okay, this pixel, this pixel, this pixel, and the accumulation of pixels with those colors, what is the species? And it does that for all 1.5 million images and basically pulls them saying, okay, that identifies a wild pig because we already identified it, that identifies a coyote, and how well can it do it? It does that using this math. You don't need to understand it. And if you want to ask me more about the math, send me questions or communicate with me after the talk. And then this math is for every single neuron to start with, and then groups of neurons. And then what we end up doing is you end up stacking that in what's known as a block. And this is what's known as a deep neural network, and it goes through every single one of these blocks to eventually come out at the end with an identifiable, hopefully identifiable set of images. You don't need to do all of this part. And the really great thing about working with this team is this whole process has now been set up as an R package. So for those who are really interested and you know how to get onto GitHub, you can actually go to an R package. It's known as Machine Learning for Wildlife Image Identification in R. And what I'm about to show you, you'll be able to apply right now to your own images. So to do this, we actually grabbed all these images, not just from our study site, we actually grabbed even a bigger set of images from across the US. And we ended up not just having 1.5 million images, we actually went to California, Colorado, Florida, South Carolina, Texas, and even Canada. And we had 3,741,000 images actually classified and verified by people. So they were known, we hoped, all known, right? We retained 10% of them as a test, right? They were not used in the actual development of the model. And we identified there was 27 species or groups that we had enough imagery to use in the actual neural network to identify. So that means we're hoping to be able to identify 27 species when an image comes up. That makes sense? What's that one? Black bear. Not just a bear, it's a black bear. We have grizzlies in Canada. It can't be just a black bear. Yeah, so it's a bear. And that one's actually on, that's on Buck Island Ranch. Let's come up to the camera. And so the species that we actually put in there were things like moose, cattle, quail. Sometimes they were groups. So quail is hard to separate out. Elk. We're really interested in one way down here. It's called wild pig. But we're actually looking at across the board how well this actual process works. And so if you just take cattle, for instance, across the top, because it's the most common species. So we look at cattle, we look at the number of training images, that's the third column, 1.8 million training images. Number of test images is 200,000, all right, about 10%. So the ability of the model to recognize the species is called recall. And so in cattle, it's the top, it's got so many images, 99% of the time, or 99% confident time, it will identify a cow if it's there. That's pretty good, eh? So you go all the way down to wild pig, and we can do the same sort of thing. 287,000 pigs, 31,000 were in the test images. It was able to actually identify 98% of them appropriately. All right, that's better than, it's better than what I was telling you about with people. And so now we've got a tool that can actually identify at least these sets of species quite well, not all of them. So if you actually go to, where's a good one? Mustelid, okay, a mustelid. I mean, that's a pretty broad group, you know, otters, all sorts of things. There's only 2,000 images in there. Number of test images, 200, but it's only 77%, all right? And so that's pretty impressive to me. And we had very, very low false positive rates and false negative rates across the board when you actually had a large number of images. And we can graph that for all of these species. We can actually put it into a recall graph, and we can actually ask, okay, based on the number of initial training images, how well were you able to actually identify species on average out of that group of 27? All right, so if you had 1,000 images, 10 to the 3, you weren't very good. You're down the bottom. But if you go up to 1 million images, 10 to the 6, you're getting close to 1, meaning perfect identification. And so I suppose the best way to describe it is the more you see a species, the better you are going to be at identifying it in all sorts of situations. I'm going to give you an example of that. So on the right, is a correctly classified image by the model. Sorry, on your left, I tell a lie. So on your left, there's a correctly classified image by the model. It's a wild pig. Who can see a pig? Come on. Where's the pig? What was the confidence of the model that it was a pig? Can you read that? 96.1%. And guess what? It's actually there. It's right there. That's actually the back leg of a pig walking out of the image. And that model was able to classify that particular image as a pig, and it got it right. And it said, I'm pretty confident, I'm 96% confident that this is a wild pig from everything of the the 3.7 million images used to train me. This thing's a pig. And then it says it could be a cow, but the likelihood is only 2%. Does that make sense? There may be nothing in there, which is what you all were thinking, but that's only 1.5%. And there's a minuscule possibility that's a white-tailed deer or moose. I'm showing this because this is the output that you will get from the R package, okay? So if you actually ran this on an image, you'd be able to do this. So the one on the right is incorrectly classified by the model, or it's not very well classified. So it actually says it's a wild pig, all right? And it looks like a bit of fur very close up. So it could be an ear, it could be a neckline. Who knows exactly what that is? But even so, for these top 5 guesses, it's saying wild pig, could be cow, could be a moose. It's actually taken in Florida, so the moose is probably not useful. And actually putting location with these, you could actually pull some of this stuff out. It could be a black bear, it could be a bobcat. It's actually a cow. It was its second choice. So the model is actually still pretty good, and you can actually still use all of this data when you actually try and do image classification. So the reason I'm showing you this is you can actually say, okay, what's my confidence of identification that I'm going to accept? So if I accept 96% confidence or 98% confidence, how likely is it going to be the right species? Does that make sense? So you can choose. If you pulled this all the way down, you said, okay, I'm going to accept any wild pig that's identified as 48% confidence, you'd be wrong a lot of the time because this was actually a cow. But if you actually did it at 96, you're not, all right? But you're still going to get some wrong. So that's the importance of parts of these processes. And this is on the test image. So this is the confidence of the model when it was applied to all those test images. And what you can see is the wild pig, you can see a really, really big peak on the right-hand side. And that red line is everything above the 95% confidence. There are very, very few pigs below that 95% confidence. And if they did fall below that, you could still use them, but what you would say is you'd flag them and say, okay, I need to verify this because the confidence of the model is not as high as what I want it to be. If it's above 95% confidence, we might be getting to the point where we just say, forget it, my job's done. It's a pig, and I'm just going to accept it because there's less error in the computer identifying it than what you would with a person. Does that make sense? So that's really good for pigs. It was really good for cattle. It's great for deer. It's even good for crows. And the big thing you need to know here is that the more training you do for these models, the better the output is. So if we collect more and more and more and more images and retrain these models or this artificial intelligence network, you'll get a better job done. So one of the things I'm going to ask people in the long run is if you've got, and this is for people online too, is if you've got large data sets of identified imagery and we can pull them all and we can work to actually develop this model trained again, we would do a better job even than this. And you'd get close to 1 over time. So back to the very beginning, this is the whole group of people that were involved in this study. People here were involved in actually identifying the imagery, collecting all the data, warehousing the data, writing the code, dealing with millions of images. And it couldn't have been done without a big group and especially the funding of the USDA veterinary services for the actual feral swine. Well, it's actually the National Wild Pig Program nationally. And this is not just going to be good for pigs, this is going to be good for any camera analysis study done from here on. And the great thing, and I talked about it at the very beginning, is that this is actually all available now in GitHub. And so you can train yourself to actually use this code and actually develop this for your own pictures. There's 2 things here. There's our already trained model, okay, that you can use and apply to actually any image. I would suggest that you apply it to only images that were collected in the areas that I mentioned at the beginning. So California, Florida, South Carolina, Canada. I will tell you that the image classification process gets worse if the image doesn't come from the area that you're actually trying to classify. And that's because it's actually classifying the whole image as a species, not just the species as we think of it. That's a bit confusing, but think through that. The other side of this is that when you actually train these neural networks, it takes a lot of computing power. So our original training was done on a supercomputer, and it takes an awful lot of time to do that. If you tried to actually train with 3.7 million pictures on your laptop to actually train the neural network, it would probably take months of just running it. The difference is once it's trained and you can grab that training module and just push images to the trained model, it takes seconds, okay? And so our model now, if you actually pushed imagery to it, can then identify a couple of thousand images an hour. And so over time, we've actually been able to identify all 7 million images in this data set in about 2 weeks. Right? Now, there's still some verification there, but that's the process, and that's the power of actually using a machine learning approach to this. This is all free, it's all open access. Anybody's allowed to go here and use it. And excuse me. And you can go to GitHub, download it, and go for it with yourself. In the long run, it's going to get better and better, and I hope people get more engaged in this type of activity. This special thanks to people who allowed us to actually collect all this information. And if you want to contact me about this particular project, my email is here. All right, thanks everybody. Anybody online, if you've got questions, put them in now, please. Any questions from the floor? Yeah, so Juliana asked how the model behaved when we have more than one species in a picture. I don't know. I actually have to go and look at that. So we did identify for multiple species, and those animals did go into the actual image. So I suspect well in some cases, but they could be some of the problems that you actually have when you don't get a well-identified species, or you get potentially split identification. So when you've got multiple species in there, and it might say, okay, here's a pig and a cow. It can't choose, so it's going both ways. Yeah, so you would probably get lower confidence. Yeah. Any more from the floor before I ask a question here? So online we have, do you know how many pigs are on Buck Island from the game cameras? It's obviously somebody from Buck Island. Yeah. Yeah, so there's actually about 4.5 million pictures that have been collected from Buck Island itself. Another question on here by Machala is, how about identifying specific individuals, classifying into age groups for population reconstruction models? It's actually a really good question, and we tried to do that. And unique ID is possible, and that's how facial recognition works for humans. But to actually do it on lots and lots of species at once would be hard. We've actually extracted all of the wild pig imagery now, and so we have about 300,000 images of just pigs, and some of them actually are uniquely marked. And we're actually seeing if this type of software can identify uniquely marked individuals. So the problem there, and we'll go back to what I said at the beginning, was that the ability of the software to identify a species is how often it sees it, okay? So if you actually put in a uniquely marked individual and you only have one image of it, the ability of the software is pretty low at being able to actually identify a unique individual. But from our purpose, we wanted to just get to the pigs, and then it's going to be the user person, the next round of people looking at it, highly trained people are going to be doing the unique identification. That's still best from a person. Matt Chop said, fantastic results, thanks for sharing. And then here's another question that comes up from Matt Chop is training ID includes daytime, nighttime, and background color. So that's a pretty interesting question. And when you start to think about how images are taken on cameras, they are quite different. So we were pretty amazed that this pool of imagery includes daytime pictures, nighttime pictures, and if you read the paper, we pulled out nighttime pictures and asked if it was just as good. It is. And then we also looked at whether or not color imagery compared to black and white imagery made any difference, and it doesn't either. So that's pretty interesting in itself, because some of these things don't have 3 bands, right? And the final thing regarding the image training like that is that, remember, the background actually is important. So it's actually not pulling the image, it's not pulling the species out of the background. The background is actually part of the image. And that's why the image itself does not, image classification does not do very well if you transfer it to a different background. So if we had all pigs identified here in the classification, then we tried to use our model only trained in Florida and said, okay, identify all those pigs on snow background in Canada. It probably wouldn't do anywhere near as well. But if you included both pigs on snow and pigs with grass backgrounds and oak backgrounds and pulled them all together, it would do well across both sites. So there is the capability of getting this to work nationally. And that's where it would hopefully go in the long run. And this could be held somewhere. Yeah. So to retrain it takes time. Okay. So there is. So yes, we'd like to retrain it. I'd like to retrain it just for Florida and collect actual data sets from Florida and make it very, very accurate, potentially for a wider group of species in Florida. And so we might have enough images of, I don't know, some unusual rat from somewhere, stick nest rat, or that we could actually identify really well, or maybe even down to species of bird. So maybe you've got enough images of sandhill cranes or great herons, or these sorts of things, and you'll be able to do it. But when you do that, you need the supercomputer to train it. Luckily, we have one in Gainesville, so the data, we should be able to do it. All right. I'm just seeing if there's any more questions online. Well, thanks everybody for attending. And one last announcement is that Brent Sellers is giving our next talk. It's on management of Brunswick grass in Bahia grass seed production fields, and it's on the 8th of January. So if you can make it, please come.